Her husband sold her land behind her back. But when a silent Cheyenne billionaire stepped in, everything changed, and the town would never forget her name. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. The first betrayal came with a kiss. Under the peach sky of a frontier morning, Anna Mae Holloway pressed her hand into the soil behind her cabin, still damp from the evening dew. This land had belonged to her father, and his father before him. It cradled generations of sweat, prayers, and buried sorrow. Anna Mae's boots sank into it with reverence, and her fingertips brushed the edge of her corn rows, the stalks just beginning to bud with life. It was sacred. It was everything. And she didn't know that just an hour before sunrise, her husband, Silas, had ridden into Bitter Ridge and signed it all away. The townsfolk had whispered about Silas for years, about his dice games in the saloon and the new boots he wore when his farm hadn't seen a harvest in 2 years. But Anna Mae had never doubted him. Not when he came limping home with bruised knuckles. Not when he kissed her cheek and said, "Trust me." She had trusted him even as the carriage pulled up that afternoon, bearing legal documents with her name nowhere on them. Even as the man with the slick black hat said the land now belonged to a mining company, and she had 3 days to leave. And even when Silas stood behind the stranger, saying nothing, it wasn't until nightfall that Anna Mae sat beneath the withered apple tree, watching the house lights blink out one by one. She didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because the betrayal was too deep to summon tears. Her calloused hands ran across her wedding ring, cold and too tight. She took it off and buried it beside the tree, just like she had buried her trust. By the second morning, Silas was gone too. Vanished with the mining man's money and no note behind. He left her with a house no longer hers, land stripped from her soul, and a county that only nodded with pity when she walked by. Bitter Ridge had never been kind to half Cheyenne women, but now it was cruel in the open. The townsfolk smiled with their lips and sneered with their eyes. They didn't see a woman betrayed, they saw a woman reduced, a mistake corrected. But not everyone looked away. In the northern hills where the clouds touched the land, whispers had begun. A man had returned after a long exile. A man whose bloodline bore the weight of thunder and whose fortune had been carved from the scars of a stolen past. His name was Tahoma Black Elk, and he did not believe in accidents-only consequences. And he had read about the land, about Anna Mae, and he remembered her grandfather, Standing Bear, who once gave his own rationed corn to a starving stranger who wandered near their homestead. That stranger had been Tahoma's father. So, when Anna Mae loaded her last basket of seeds onto a wagon bound for nowhere, she had no idea that redemption was already riding down from the hills. It wore no armor, it carried no banner. But it knew the cost of injustice, and it had come to repay a debt carved into memory. The wind on the third morning was colder than any June wind should have been. It whistled through the wooden ribs of Anna Mae's cabin like it was morning. Something, maybe the silence that had swallowed her home, maybe the roots that had been cut without warning. She stood on the porch barefoot, her boots worn out from walking into town and back with no hope. Each trip reminded her of how quickly people forget your worth when your land is no longer yours. A few women offered her cold bread. A shopkeeper gave her a look of thin charity. No one asked what Silas had done. She had 3 hours left before the men from the mining company returned with chains and papers to make sure she was gone. She didn't plan on watching them hammer her legacy apart. She'd already packed her mother's shawl, her father's old rifle, and a jar of cornbread she'd made 2 days ago when she still thought things might be fixed. She hadn't eaten since, but deep in the pines beyond the East Ridge, a figure had been watching her for 2 days. He never stepped beyond the tree line, but he saw her every move. He saw the way she knelt in the garden even after the land was sold, saw her pull her father's hatchet from the barn and slice down the crooked fence as if reclaiming dignity in every swing. And he remembered her. Not as Anna Mae Holloway, wife of Silas, but as the girl who once stitched moccasins for orphaned children during the long drought. The girl whose mother had braided his sister's hair when white women refused to touch her. His name was Tahoma Black Elk, and though the world now called him a billionaire recluse, his memory stretched further than the gold mine he owned across the canyon. He didn't wear his wealth. His horse bore no ornaments. His hat was plain. His voice, when he used it, sounded like it came from somewhere older than the hills. And for 2 days he had not spoken to her, only watched. Until now, he rode down the hill as quietly as fog. Not toward the cabin, but toward the marker by the apple tree where Anna May had buried her wedding ring. He didn't know what it was at first, only that the soil had been disturbed, and that someone had pressed the ground with gentle fingers, not a shovel. He dismounted, kneeled, and placed his palm over it. The land had been wounded, but not forgotten. By the time he reached her porch, Anna May was sitting in the last chair her father had built. She didn't stand when he approached. She didn't ask his name. She was too tired to be afraid, and too proud to show it. He simply took off his hat, nodded once, and handed her a small folded piece of paper. It was the original deed to the land, not a copy, not a threat, not a promise, the real deed. Her name was scrawled in ink that had faded with age, but it was unmistakably hers. The property, it stated, was granted to Mary and Joseph Holloway, and all descendants born of their bloodline. It had never included Silas, not legally, not spiritually. Somehow, Tahoma had found it. But Anna May's eyes didn't tear up, not yet, because the past 3 days had stolen her belief in mercy. She didn't ask him how he'd come by the deed. Didn't question whether it was forged. She simply nodded once and turned back to her garden. Clutching the paper like a lost limb that night, Bitter Ridge shook. The mining company's office burned not with fire, but with noise. Legal noise, contracts overturned, permits revoked. Investigations opened. Men in suits rode into town, shaking hands and scrawling letters on courthouse doors. But no one knew who had started it. No one, except the man in the pines, who now watched from a distance, not out of caution, but respect. And in the quiet hours before dawn, Anna May stepped into her land once more, not as a widow, not as a woman cast aside, but as a rightful heir. What she didn't know was that Tahoma wasn't done. He hadn't just returned to right a wrong. He had come to challenge the very foundation of who got to own the land and why. Because somewhere in the dust and betrayal, he had seen something more than justice. He had seen a future, and it began with her. The morning after her redemption wasn't golden, it was gray, not with clouds, but with silence. The kind of silence that falls after the world takes a breath, unsure whether to cheer or condemn. Bitter Ridge was watching. From windows, from porches, from saloon doorways that no longer creaked open to welcome her. Anna May walked her land with the deed folded and pressed against her chest beneath her coat. She had said nothing. No threats, no sermons. But the land spoke for her now. It was hers again, and it remembered who had tried to take it. She walked the perimeter like her grandfather once did, marking each post with charcoal on old Cheyenne tradition that said, "This land lives because I walk it." Every step she took, she tried to feel if the soil had forgiven her for almost leaving it. She passed the burned fence, the dead oak near the stream, the crooked shed Silas never repaired. And then, without knowing why, she stopped near the far north patchland she had never planted on, where wild grass grew taller than a man's hip. That's where she saw the old rock. It jutted out of the ground like a broken tooth. Her grandfather had once called it sacred, but Silas always said it was worthless stone. She kneeled beside it, brushing away dust, and found something she hadn't noticed in 20 years, a hand-carved symbol Cheyenne made. Not a warning, a map, a direction marked by 3 lines and an arrow pointing into the earth. She didn't understand it, but someone did. That same evening, just as the sun dropped behind the far canyon, a knock echoed on her door. Not Tahoma. This time, a man in a charcoal suit, with skin like the prairie sun, and a badge of the state mining board on his chest. He wasn't here to evict her. He was here to offer her a partnership. Turns out, the mining company had done preliminary surveys months ago before trying to push her off. That patch of land wild and untouched sat on the lip of a gold vein. Not a massive one, not a fortune for a state, but enough to make a small town rich, enough to make someone desperate like Silas sell his soul, and enough to make the company go silent when Tahoma's team bought out their majority stake the week before. But Anna May didn't smile, not when the man offered percentages, or contracts, or a seat at the next mineral summit. She only said 4 words: "Get off my land." She didn't want gold, she wanted peace. Legacy, quiet mornings, and dirt under her nails. She didn't want machines tearing the earth her family was buried in. But before he left, the man gave her one last envelope, not a contract, but a check, already written, not for purchase, for silence. She burned it that night, but Tahoma returned the next day, carrying a ledger and a box. No guards, no advisors, just the quiet wind that always seemed to follow him. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He simply placed the box at her feet. Inside it were documents, original mining titles, environmental assessments, and a letter written by her grandfather to Tahoma's father long ago. It spoke of the land as something more than wealth. It was medicine. It was memory. He told her the mining company no longer existed. Its name had been dissolved. The assets folded into a non-profit bearing her grandfather's name. All exploration had been halted. The land's minerals would remain untouched. And then he opened the ledger. Anna May's eyes widened. Page after page of names: widows, orphans, displaced farmers, tribal elders, all wronged by land seizures in Bitter Ridge and beyond. At the top, in fresh ink, was hers. Tahoma wasn't just buying back her land, he was building something, a movement, a restoration of honor. And he wanted her not as a figurehead, but as a partner. That night, as Anna May lit a lantern inside her cabin and watched the wind press against the windows like a restless spirit, she knew this wasn't just about Silas anymore. It was about every betrayal carved into wood, sewn into treaties, hidden beneath polished boots. The gold beneath her feet wasn't what made her rich, it was the truth rising from it. By the end of that week, Bitter Ridge wasn't quiet anymore. It buzzed with rumors and fear disguised as gossip. The woman who once sold preserves at the corner store was now showing up in state land hearings. The same woman the sheriff once called that Cheyenne ghost now had his superior's ear. And every store that once closed its doors to her now kept them open wide, hoping to win favor. But Anna May Holloway wasn't looking for favor. She was looking for justice. The first lawsuit came fast-filed by a crooked title broker named Earl Finch, the same man who processed her husband's false land sale. He claimed the documents she held were invalid, that the land belonged to the state now, that the survey work was manipulated, and he had friends, powerful ones, men with rings on their fingers and bourbon in their breath, who had spent decades cheating families like hers out of everything but their names. Anna May didn't flinch. She showed up to the courtroom in the same clothes she wore to church. No makeup, no lawyers, just a rolled scroll of deeds held shut with her grandfather's eagle feather, and a ledger of signed testimonies gathered from other families who had been robbed the same way. Some were dead, some too afraid to speak, but their words were there. Ink didn't tremble the way voices did. Tam Black Elk sat 3 rows behind her, silent as always. He wasn't her lawyer. He wasn't her protector. He was her witness. And that meant more. The courtroom smelled of sweat and cologne, but it was Anna May's presence that changed the air. She read aloud the first letter, Dying Widows, account of how her land had been taken for a dam that never got built. Then a soldier's last statement before he passed, handwritten with shaking hands. My grandfather's land was traded for silence. Don't let them erase it. One by one, she laid the papers before the judge, not as exhibits, but as tombstones. The defense laughed. Earl Finch's attorney, a man with a sharp chin and eyes like rotted milk, made jokes about sentimentality. He said Anna May was trying to buy history with emotion. That land wasn't a story. It was a transaction. But the courtroom went still when the judge asked for the original deed. Anna May stepped forward, hands calm, and presented the document. Signed by her ancestors, real ink, real seal, backed by tribal law and the old treaties. Finch's smile disappeared. Then came the twist. The judge called a recess and summoned the state clerk. Turns out, Finch's files had mysteriously vanished from the Public Records Office 3 days before the court session. But Anna Mae's copies were intact. Not only intact, but notarized by a witness still living to Homer's lawyer, who entered the courtroom like a THUNDERCLOUD. In 30 minutes, the judge issued a provisional ruling. Not only was Anna Mae's land fully hers, but any properties processed by Finch during a certain 5-year span would be subject to audit. Gasps filled the room. Earl Finch collapsed in his seat. But Anna Mae didn't smile. She didn't look at the crowd. She only looked at the floor, the ground that her mother walked, her father worked, and her grandfather bled for. Outside the courthouse, news cameras waited. A journalist shoved a microphone toward her. "Miss Holloway," he said breathlessly, "how does it feel to win?" Anna Mae looked out across the dusty courthouse steps, past the townsfolk now pretending they'd always stood with her. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It just carried the weight of a woman who had waited too long to be heard. "This isn't a win," she said. "It's a correction." And then she walked away, not as a plaintiff, not as a symbol, but as the storm that no one had seen coming. The celebration never came. Not from Anna Mae, and not from the land. Justice had stirred, but it hadn't settled. After the court ruling, the Holloway property returned to her name officially. And yet the air around Bitter Ridge grew tighter, heavier. The old ghosts had been rattled, and not everyone liked seeing a woman walk into rooms their grandfathers once declared off-limits. It started with silence again, but a different kind of silence. Store clerks, who once offered polite greetings, now barely looked up. The sheriff stopped riding his usual route near her lane. Children whispered warnings their parents had fed them. And then came the real sign. A dead coyote nailed to her gate. A message. A coward's threat. Anna Mae didn't flinch. She buried the animal with hands that trembled, but never paused. Her ancestors had endured worse, and her victory in court had inspired more than threats. It had sparked confessions. Other families, white, black, and native alike, came forward with forged titles, land lost, names misspelled in records. Her mailbox overflowed with letters from across counties. Some begged for help. Some just said thank you. But one letter changed everything. It came sealed in rawhide, marked only with a red handprint. Inside, a name she hadn't heard since childhood, Elijah Copperherner, Cheyenne elder, who had once been declared mentally unfit after claiming to witness the state falsifying tribal land maps. He had vanished decades ago. But the letter said he was alive, hidden, and he had proof, maps, ledgers, even photographs of the original treaties. All he needed was trust and protection. To Homer came that night. No words, just the shared recognition that things were escalating. That they had walked too far to turn back now. At dawn, Anna Mae packed food and clothes into a small bag and rode north. Following the map the letter provided, to Homer followed at a distance, not to crowd her, but to ensure she wasn't alone. The trail led deep into the shadowed woods, past the river where the land turned darker with old stories. They found Elijah in a crumbling root cellar beneath a cabin covered in moss and prayer beads. He hadn't aged well. His hair was long and brittle, his skin folded like bark, but his eyes were sharp, untouched by time. He welcomed Anna Mae with no ceremony. Just placed the bundle in her lap, as if he had been waiting all these years just for her. Inside were documents that shook the earth beneath her. Original boundary maps, pre-statehood, land agreements, and a list of bribes paid to men in Bitter Ridge going back 50 years. The very foundation of the county rested on fraud. But before she could make copies, before she could even pack it into her bag, the fire came. It started with smoke curling over the trees, silent and cruel. Then the crack of kindling, the scream of timber, and the howl of frightened horses. Someone had followed them. Someone had known. The cabin, lit like a funeral pyre. Elijah shoved the documents into Aname's arms and pushed her through the back exit carved into the hill. Tahoma appeared like a storm, pulling her onto his horse and galloping away as flames devoured the earth behind them. Elijah didn't run. He stood at the entrance and sang a Cheyenne prayer until the roof collapsed over him. His legacy, though, had already been saved. Aname didn't speak the entire ride home. She clutched the bundle against her chest like it was life itself. When they reached her cabin, she didn't cry. Not even as the first ash flakes floated down with the morning mist. That night, she spread the documents across her table. Every word, every number, every name. And she lit candles around the room, not for comfort, but for clarity. They had tried to erase her. Then they tried to burn the truth. Now it was her turn to light a fire. The last storm didn't come with rain. It came with footsteps, hundreds of them. Boots worn from farmland, moccasins softened by trail dust, shoes polished from courthouse floors. Aname stood on the steps of Bitter Ridges. Old Town Hall, no longer the woman betrayed in silence, but the face of something the state could no longer ignore. Around her, families gathered with hands full of papers, faces full of fury, and hearts full of memory. They had come because they had heard. Not from newspapers, not from radio, but from each other. The documents Elijah Copperhone gave her had been copied, catalogued, and mailed out. County after county responded. Land loss wasn't isolated, it was systematic. And Aname's fight had become the first match struck. In a forest of kindling. When the mayor of Bitter Ridge refused to open the doors to the town hall, Aname unlocked them herself. Tahoma stood behind her, saying nothing. His presence enough to silence any who doubted her right to speak. Inside, the mountain of files laid bare a history most wanted: buried maps redrawn to shrink tribal territories, property seized from widows under forged names, children adopted out of their families with no paper trail. It wasn't just land they'd stolen, it was blood, lineage, identity. But Aname hadn't come to recount every pain. She came to demand restoration. A proposal was drafted and placed on every councilman's desk. The Holloway Restoration Act, a local mandate backed by tribal law, state precedent, and community signatures giving families the legal right to reclaim land lost to proven fraud within a 60-year window. Most officials laughed at it until Tahoma stepped forward. He placed a sealed envelope on the mayor's desk. Inside, a certified check that would cover the next 10 years of county budget on one condition. The act passed without amendment. The mayor stared at it for a long time, then passed it to the next official. By the time it made its way around the table, the vote was unanimous. Aname didn't cheer. She didn't raise a fist. She just nodded once and walked out into the courtyard where the people waited. Someone asked her what would happen now. Would she stay? Would she run for office? Would she build a monument? She simply said, "I'll farm," and she did, not for profit, not for praise, but for memory. For the ancestors, for the generations who'd never seen their names written where they belonged. Her cabin was repaired, repainted, and turned into the first rural legal clinic in the region. Free services. No appointments. People came with deeds, stories, questions, hope. The very soil that once saw her nearly erased now gave birth to change. As for Tahoma, he didn't vanish. But he remained as he had always been: quiet, constant, just beyond the ridge. He funded dozens of land return projects, bought back old cemeteries, turned into construction zones, and sat on no throne. The only time he came to town was to visit Elijah's grave, which lay beside the apple tree Aname once buried her wedding ring under. It bloomed, now fully, wildly, defiantly. One spring evening, Aname walked through her field, fingers brushing the tall corn, the sun painting her shoulders gold. She looked out at Bitter Ridge not as an outsider, but as the fire it never saw coming. Because frontier redemption didn't begin in courtrooms or ledgers. It began the moment one woman chose not to vanish quietly. It began the moment a match was struck where everything else had gone cold. It began the moment she realized they could take the land, but never the root. and the mountain would never forget her name.